The man who would eventually stand silent at her gate for 4 consecutive minutes had never lost a single night's sleep over the cold. Harlan Voss ran 4,000 head of cattle across Flint Rock Basin, Dakota Territory, and the open range had never once failed him. He would be the last person in the basin to understand why it failed him in the end, and the first to arrive at her door when it did. But that morning belonged to a different season, a different year, and a woman who had not yet built the thing he would eventually come to need more than he had ever needed anything. Ingrid Halverson stepped off the freight wagon into a landscape that had no interest in her opinion of it. The grass ran west without asking permission, blue-green and absolute, and the sky pressed down with a weight she had never encountered in the close valleys of southern Norway, where hills held the horizon at a reasonable distance. No trees worth naming stood anywhere in the sightline. The wind had started somewhere beyond the Black Hills and stopped for nothing visible on the prairie. She stood on the edge of her 60 homestead acres with a leather satchel across one shoulder, a wool comb tucked inside it that had belonged to her grandmother, and a homestead certificate giving her legal claim to ground that did not yet care whether she lived or died on it. She was 34 years old. She had been a widow for 13 months. Her husband, Eric, had been a quiet man with carpenter's hands who died of pneumonia in the Minnesota winter of 1884, and the silence he left behind had a different texture than ordinary silence, heavier, directional, always pointing at the empty chair. His sister remarried within the year. The new husband was not cruel, only deliberate in the way he occupied every room he entered, until the cabin felt measurably smaller each week. Ingrid watched this process with the patience of someone taking structural measurements, and when she had enough information, she made a decision. She sold the milk cow Eric's family had given them as a wedding gift. She bought passage on the Northern Pacific Railroad to Bismarck. She filed the homestead certificate she had been carrying in the leather satchel for 6 months, and she did not ask anyone's permission before leaving. A letter arrived from Eric's parents before her departure, written in their shaking handwriting. Tobias, Eric's 16-year-old son from his first marriage, had lived with them since his own mother died in childbirth. The grandparents were too old. There was no one else willing to take the boy. He would come to her in autumn, the letter said, because she had promised Eric in the last lucid conversation they ever shared that she would look after the boy if something happened to him. Ingrid read the letter twice, folded it carefully into the satchel beside the wool comb, and did not think about it again until September, when the freight wagon rolled in and deposited a boy who was all angles and deliberate distance. She found her 60 acres along a creek that ran year-round even in drought, years of facts she confirmed through 3 separate conversations with men who had survived Dakota winters before deciding to file her claim. The first summer she spent in a sod dugout built into the south-facing slope above the creek, sleeping on a plank bed, she constructed herself cooking over a small iron stove she had hauled from Bismarck on the same freight wagon that carried her trunk. The basin was more beautiful than anything she had any right to expect, and more hostile than anything she had allowed herself to fully imagine. The wind was the first serious lesson. It did not blow in Dakota so much as reside there a permanent condition of the landscape, and every structure that failed to account for it paid in drafts and heat loss, and animals that shivered without recovering through the long months of January and February. By autumn of 1885, she had purchased 40 sheep from a rancher named Garrett Finch, who was consolidating his operation and selling off the sheep stock he could no longer run efficiently alongside his cattle. Finch was a weathered man in his mid-50s with a permanent squint from years of reading distant terrain, and he watched her count the flock with careful attention, assessing her judgment without committing to a verdict. She also acquired 2 milk cows, a dozen chickens, and a mule she paid too much for, and named Corbin after no one in particular because naming a mule well prevents arguments. And Corbin earned her trust inside the first month by declining to panic during the first November storm, when every other animal on the property expressed its displeasure at the weather. That quality of composure, she decided, was precisely what she most needed in her animals. The basin operated on a particular theology in those years. Cattle ranchers drove their herds onto public grass in May, left them there through October, then either shipped them to the railhead at Bismarck or turned them loose for winter to find whatever grass they could paw up from beneath the snow. The entire economy of Flint Rock Basin rested on the assumption that range cattle were constitutionally equipped to survive without human assistance, that any rancher who built shelter for his stock expressed a kind of weakness or foreign softness that had no place on the northern plains. Ingrid heard some version of this theology from nearly every man she encountered since arriving. She did not argue with it. She stored it alongside information about local flood patterns and prevailing wind direction, useful data about what the community had decided to believe, which was distinct from what the temperature would do in January. The knowledge she had brought from Norway was not a theory. It was a practice inherited across 3 generations from her grandmother Astrid, who had grown up in the Telemark region where winter ran from October through May, and every family that survived had internalized something fundamental about the difference between cold air, still air, and the materials that separated one from the other. Astrid had been a practical woman who distrusted explanations that could not be demonstrated with open hands. The demonstration she gave Ingrid on a cold afternoon when Ingrid was 9 years old involved pressing the child's small palm flat against the wall of the family's winter barn, which had been built with double-layered board walls and raw wool packed tightly between them. The wool yielded slightly under pressure and then pushed back. That resistance carried the entire lesson. Astrid's voice had the patience of someone who had watched people learn the same thing for 40 years. If it yields a little and returns, the density is correct. If your hand sinks deep without resistance, there is not enough wool. If the surface holds rigid and will not yield at all, you have packed it too tight and killed the air inside. She lifted Ingrid's hand away, and they watched the wool surface slowly recover its shape. Wool is the only material that remembers how to insulate even when wet. The lanolin, the natural oil in the fleece, the grease the wash tries to remove, that is what prevents moisture from destroying its function. Do not ever forget what this feels like beneath your hand. Ingrid had carried that sensation across the Atlantic and across half a continent into a sod dugout in Dakota Territory, where she lay on winter nights with the wind finding every imperfection in her construction. The dugout kept her alive through the winter of 1885 into 1886, which was the only standard it had been designed to meet. What it failed to give her was any confidence that her animals would survive what the land was capable of producing. 40 sheep in a sod shelter with inadequate drainage, lost body condition, quickly wet wool was worse than no wool wet. Hooves rotted, and a sick flock in January was a dead flock by March. She nursed one ewe through foot rot before Christmas that first winter, spending the better part of 3 weeks on a case that would have been preventable with proper flooring and drainage. That was 40 sheep. What she intended to build would need to hold twice that many in conditions that would make December seem hospitable. She began in the spring of 1886 as soon as the frost released from the post-hole depth she required. The design she carried in memory was not complicated, but it demanded precision in ways that most local construction did not bother with. Stone footings dug 4 feet into the ground to prevent the frost heave that had split 2 other structures in the basin the previous winter. Double-row cottonwood stud walls, outer row, inner row, separated by an 8-inch cavity with horizontal blocking every 4 feet to keep the cavity from settling under its own weight as it was filled. A low-pitched shed roof with deep eaves and a continuous ridge vent she disguised as ordinary cupboard. Each door built as a sandwich of inner and outer plank skins, with a 4-inch wool batting core, every door fitted with a felt gasket that compressed when the door closed and sealed the frame against the convective drafts that cost more heat than any other single factor in cold climate construction. A 6x4 vestibule at the main entrance with 2 sets of doors so that outside air could never penetrate the main space directly. The floor-broken stone at the base for drainage, then 3 inches of compressed wool, felt then heavy planks on floor joists, then straw bedding on top, nearly 14 inches between frozen ground and the surface where her animals would stand. None of this attracted significant attention until she began filling the wall cavity. She drove her wagon into Gravel Ford twice each month through June and July, returning with raw fleece she purchased from the Flint Rock Basin Wool Growers Cooperative at their Railhead warehouse, where unsold lower-grade fleece accumulated after shearing season. The cooperative's agent was glad to move material the Eastern buyers had refused, damaged cuts. Second cuts, anything carrying too much vegetable matter to be worth freight costs to the textile mills. Ingrid had negotiated 3 cents per pound for this material, and she bought it deliberately and in quantity. 400 pounds in June, 400 more in July. By the end of August, she had 1,200 pounds in rough burlap sacks stacked around the construction site, and opinions were forming throughout the basin with the speed of information that has entertainment value. Calhoun Briggs sat his horse at her property line on a Tuesday afternoon in late July and watched her work for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. Briggs ran 400 head of cattle on the range north of her claim, had done so for 6 years, and held himself as the unofficial voice of sound ranching practice in the basin. He was a large man carrying the particular confidence that accumulates when one's judgment has never been publicly tested against disaster. When he finally spoke, the tone was that of a man offering a correction out of civic generosity. "Mrs. Halverson, what on earth are you doing with that wool?" Her hands kept moving, paddle pressing and releasing against the fleece in the open cavity. "Filling the walls, Mr. Briggs. The cavity needs insulation and wool fills it well." He shifted weight in the saddle. "Wool is a commodity. You are taking something with cash value and destroying it. Put that into your walls and the mice will be nesting in it before Thanksgiving moths breeding in it by April." "The off-grade fleece I'm buying has no cash value," she said. "The buyers at Bismarck refuse it. The cooperative sells it to me at 3 cents because otherwise it sits until it rots." He waved the distinction aside as irrelevant. "My cattle have wintered on this range for 6 years without a single enclosed structure. They eat snow when they need water. They paw through 3 feet of drift to reach grass. They are built for this country, Mrs. Halverson. They do not need coddling, and your sheep don't need it either. What animals need is good range, a windbreak, and a hard blow, and the Lord's provision, and that has been sufficient for every serious rancher from here to the Yellowstone." She did not argue. She had learned in Minnesota that disputing animal husbandry with men who had not yet encountered a season that challenged their assumptions was a transaction that cost time without producing results. She nodded politely, returned to her work, and listened to his horse carry him back north. That evening she opened her ledger and wrote in careful script, "Briggs cites 6 mild winters as proof. 6 mild winters prove nothing. The question is not whether the cold can kill, the question is when it chooses to." Tobias arrived on the freight wagon from Minnesota in the second week of August, carrying 1 trunk and an expression that announced the arrangement was in his assessment temporary. He was 16 thin in the specific way of a boy whose height had arrived before his weight, and he carried himself with the deliberate formality of someone performing distance rather than feeling it. He stood in the yard and surveyed the half-finished barn with its open wall cavities and the pale mound of fleece stacked near the south entrance. Then he looked at Ingrid with the straight assessment of someone who has already decided what he is looking at, and the first words out of his mouth carried Eric's voice without Eric's warmth. "My father would never have done this." She could see Eric in the set of his jaw, in the way he held his shoulders, and the recognition moved through her chest with a complicated weight she did not let reach her face. "Help me with the far corner," she told him, holding out the flat wooden paddle. Tobias did not take it. He turned and walked toward the creek without another word. She watched him go with the stillness of someone who knows that the first conversation is rarely the important one. The pattern that established itself over the weeks that followed had the logic of water-finding channels. Tobias spent his mornings at Briggs's operation north of the creek, where the men extended the rough warmth they offered any boy willing to do cattle work without complaint. Briggs gave him his first proper cowboy hat and spent evenings telling stories about the open range that made it sound like the only honest way a man could live. Tobias rode home in the evenings smelling of horses and worked leather and spoke to Ingrid only when the structure of the meal made it unavoidable. He was not cruel in any deliberate way. He was simply absent, and the absence held a temperature of its own. She understood that he was not choosing Briggs's ranch so much as choosing a version of his father's world that still existed, the world of practical men who worked the open range without apology, over the version of his father's world that had ended in a Minnesota bedroom in January. Late August brought Reverend Aldous Crane on a Sunday afternoon. Crane was the only minister within 50 miles of Gravel Ford, a lean, careful man of 52, with the watchful eyes of someone who reads the moral temperature of a situation before committing to a position. He walked the barn perimeter, twice examining the wool-packed sections, not yet sheathed, running a finger along the double framing with an expression that combined concern with something more calculated. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who believed his concern was a form of generosity. "I understand you brought these methods from the old country, Mrs. Halverson, from your grandmother's people." "From my grandmother," she said. "From Astrid. She learned from her mother before her. It is not folklore, it is a practice. I don't question your grandmother's intentions." He paused, measuring the weight of what came next. "But I want to share something with you as your pastor. The people of this territory have built their livelihoods on a trust in divine provision. The cattle are strong. The sheep carry their wool on their backs for a reason. When we construct elaborate protections beyond what God has already furnished, We may be expressing doubt rather than faith, a refusal to trust the design he has already established. The blood rose in her face not as anger, but as something occupying the same space. Every rancher who had laughed at her construction had laughed at the method. Crane was not laughing at the method. He was questioning the source of the knowledge itself, suggesting that what 3 generations of Norwegian women had learned through years of cold and consequence might represent a failure of faith rather than an accumulation of craft. My grandmother believed in God. She told him, her voice level in a way her hands were not. She believed he created wool with lanolin and crimped fiber and hollow structure so that people and animals could survive in places where survival should not be possible. She considered wasting what he had provided to be the sin not using it. Crane smiled the smile of a man who has heard a child say something clever that does not quite reach the point. He touched the brim of his hat, mounted, and rode back toward Gravel Ford. The damage his visit produced was not immediate. It moved through the community the way a hairline fracture moves through stone in every direction, following the path of least resistance. Within 2 weeks, the general view at the Gravel Ford General Store had shifted from amused skepticism about the wool walls to something with more social weight. Ingrid was no longer merely eccentric. She was a foreign woman whose ideas about walls and provision came from a foreign way of thinking about what God owed his creation. Tobias heard every iteration of this view. He absorbed it the way a young person absorbs the consensus of the community he has chosen to belong to. And one September evening, he came through the dugout door and said what Ingrid had known was coming since the day he arrived. "You are making us a joke. Every serious rancher in this basin is laughing at what you are doing out there." His voice had his father's rhythms without his father's intention. "My father was American-born. He would have been ashamed." She did not answer. She walked past him down to the creek and stood in the long September light, watching the water move across stones she had learned to name by their positions. For the first time since arriving in Dakota, she wept not because Tobias was correct, not because she doubted what her grandmother's hands had taught hers, but because she heard Eric in every word the boy spoke, and the distance between the man her husband had been and the shape his son was assuming felt like something irreversible happening in slow motion with nothing she could do to interrupt it. That night, the ledger, "If Eric were alive, he would understand. But Eric is gone and his son does not yet know what he does not know." Evidence takes longer than grief does. Wade Dunmore came through in the second week of September on a freight run between Gravel Ford and the Eastern Line camps, driving a wagon loaded with wire fencing and post anchors. He had been slowing his team each time he passed her property throughout the summer. She had noticed the hesitation without being able to interpret it. He was about 40, with the broad hands of a man who had built things for a living since he was old enough to swing a hammer. And when he finally pulled his wagon off the track and walked to the barn, he moved through the structure the way a builder moves through another builder's work, examining the floor assembly with a crouch, pressing both palms flat against the sheathed cavity sections, tilting his head back to consider the ridge vent angle from below. He spent nearly 20 minutes this way. When he came back to where Ingrid was standing, his expression had the quality of a man who has confirmed a working hypothesis. "My father built houses outside Pittsburgh before I was born," he said, his voice practical and without ceremony. "Cold winters in those hills, not this cold, but genuine cold. He packed raw wool into his wall cavities, said it was how they built in the places he came from, and it worked there, so he saw no reason it would stop working in Pennsylvania." He looked out toward the open range where Briggs's distant cattle grazed in a line. "The ranchers in this basin have only seen mild winters. They take that as evidence they're smart. It's evidence they've been fortunate." A pause that carried its own weight. The cold doesn't know the difference between smart and lucky. Something released in Ingrid's chest. Not the validation she had refused to seek, but the recognition of a fellow practitioner who could read what she had built and know what it meant. She told him about Voss's threat to bring the construction to the Territorial Council to petition for prohibitions on what he called foreign building methods. Dunmore considered this. "Voss has connections in Bismarck." "He does." He looked back at the barn. "He is also wrong about everything else." He climbed back onto his wagon and drove east without additional commentary. Harlan Voss arrived the following week with 2 foremen and Delia Marsh, a reporter from the Bismarck Tribune, traveling through the basin, gathering material for a feature about ranch life. Voss was a large man in his early 50s, carrying the physical authority of someone whose decisions had not been seriously disputed in 3 decades, and he examined the barn with the careful attention of a man constructing an argument rather than forming a judgment. He circled the structure. He asked questions about construction costs, wool quantities, labor hours. His questions were forensic, designed to produce specific numbers he could convert into rhetoric. When he had what he needed, he delivered his assessment from the barn doorway with the confidence of a man who had never stood in his own way. Mrs. Halverson, you have constructed a very expensive coffin for sheep. Sheep do not need barns, they need range. Cattle need range even more. What you have spent on this single structure would outfit a proper operation several times over. And when an actual winter comes to this basin, not the mild stretches we have been favored with, but a real northern winter, you will find that all the wool in Dakota Territory cannot substitute for the natural toughness an animal develops when it lives without coddling. Delia Marsh wrote it all down in a small notebook with quick and precise movements. She was 28, one of 3 women in Dakota Territory doing newspaper work, and she had the particular quality of someone who takes in more than she is expected to observe. After Voss and his foreman walked back toward their horses, she stayed. She stood beside Ingrid at the barn entrance for a moment before speaking, and when she did, the careful neutrality she had maintained while Voss was present had been put away. I'm going to write this story, Mrs. Halverson. I want to be honest with you. My editor wants a piece about unusual characters on the frontier, and you qualify for that angle. The way he wants it written, the piece will not be entirely fair to you. She paused, then added with the directness of someone choosing honesty over courtesy. I could write a different story, a longer one with more technical precision and more of the actual facts, but that is not the story I was sent to write. Ingrid looked at her for a long moment, recognizing the specific situation Delia Marsh had described, a woman with more understanding than she was being given authority to deploy, choosing where to spend her credibility within constraints she had not set. Write what you need to write, Ingrid told her. The wool does not require belief in order to function. Physics does not consult journalism before doing its work. Something shifted in Delia Marsh's face, a brief tightening that might have been recognition. She wrote the Tribune address on the back of a calling card and pressed it into Ingrid's hand. If this winter is what some are predicting, she said quietly, I will come back in spring. The story I write then will be the story I want to write. 2 weeks later, the Bismarck Tribune ran a piece under the headline, Norwegian Widow Builds Sheep Hotel on Dakota Range. The article was not openly contemptuous. It was amused in the manner of something observing an oddity it did not intend to harm. Ingrid read it once, set it down, did not return to it. Tobias read it 3 times. The copy traveled through Flint Rock Basin in saddlebags and mail pouches until it had reached every ranch house between Gravel Ford and the Badlands, and the opinions it generated were uniformly in one direction. A Norwegian immigrant widow building insulated accommodations for sheep was precisely the kind of story the basin had been waiting for, harmless enough to enjoy, strange enough to repeat, foreign enough to feel superior to without effort. Iris Fenton drove her buggy out from the Fenton spread 12 miles east in the last week of September, arriving with preserved peaches and the kind of careful consideration that passes between women who have decided they are friends but have not yet tested it against anything that costs something. She toured the barn with genuine interest, pressing her palm against the wool-packed wall sections in what Ingrid recognized as an unconscious echo of the gesture she had spent the summer making. Then she said what she had driven 12 miles to say. Ingrid, dear Colton believes you have been very poorly advised. He has watched cattle winter on this range for 8 years and has never lost a single animal from lack of shelter. The Lord gave sheep wool on their backs for a reason, and the sheep that survive here survive because they were built to. Then more quietly, Tobias came to our place last week. The boy is truly unhappy. He told Colton he is ashamed of what people are saying. Ingrid thanked her for the peaches and the honesty and offered nothing in return she could use. After Iris's buggy disappeared over the East Ridge, Ingrid climbed to the loft she had built above the tack room. She had been sleeping here through the final construction phases to avoid losing working time on the trail between the dugout and the site, and sat on the straw mattress as the light changed and the wind began its evening work against the roof. She let the doubt in. She had kept it at the threshold for 4 months and owed it an honest hearing. If the winter arrived mild as the previous 6 had arrived, then every voice that had spoken against her would be confirmed, and she would have spent $400 and 7 months of labor building a monument to her own certainty. She opened the ledger. If this winter is mild, everyone is right, and I have wasted everything, the money, the labor, the months, and whatever chance I had of Tobias, seeing me as something other than the foreign woman who built a hotel for sheep. She lay still for a long time after writing it. Then she brought back the memory of Astrid's hand guiding hers against the barn wall in Telemark, the warmth coming through even on a cold morning, the wool yielding exactly the right amount under a 9-year-old's palm, the old woman's voice carrying precision rather than comfort. Her grandmother had not been a sentimental woman. She had been an exact woman who built things that lasted because she understood the physics of what she worked with, and she had given Ingrid the knowledge not as inheritance to be preserved, but as equipment to be used. This is not about believing the wool will work. This is about knowing it will work. Believing and knowing are different instruments. You cannot build with belief. You can only build with knowledge. Ingrid chose knowing. She closed the ledger. Outside, the wind pressed against the wall she had spent the summer filling, pressing and probing in the way the cold always pressed and probed, searching for the gap that would let it reach the warmth inside. The walls held. They did not shudder, did not flex, did not give a fraction of an inch. They held with the indifference of something built to hold. And in the quiet of that holding, somewhere beneath the plain arithmetic of doubled boards and packed fleece and felt gaskets, was the accumulated understanding of 3 generations of women who had faced winter straight on and built accordingly. The first snow fell October 18th, light and dry, gone before midday. The second came October 24th and stayed. By the first week of November, temperatures were dropping below -20 at night, and Ingrid moved all her animals inside the wool barn for the season. The 40 sheep first, then the milk cows, then Corbin the mule, then the chickens in their separate enclosure. They moved into their spaces with the unhurried calm of animals that had spent enough time near the structure to register it as a place of safety, and as the doors closed and the felt gaskets compressed against the frames, and the wind outside dropped to a murmur that the walls absorbed without effort, Ingrid stood in the center of the stable and listened to 40 sheep breathe. Tobias came back from Briggs's ranch on a gray November afternoon with ice in his hat brim and his coat failing against what the air had become. He stopped just inside the tack room door and looked at his stepmother without the formality that had characterized every exchange since August. His eyes went to the interior thermometer, then to the animals in their straw, then back to her. He did not address September or the conversation at the creek or the months of daily rides that had been rides away from everything she was building. What he said was direct and stripped of every inflection except the one that mattered. I will stay through the winter. Not because I think you are right, because I have nowhere else to go, and the trail to Briggs's is impassable until spring. The spare bed is in the loft, she told him. Ladder on the left. He climbed it without another word. She listened to him settle into the mattress she had prepared for him 6 weeks earlier, knowing he would eventually come back. She completed her evening rounds, checking the water trough, forking the last hay into the feeding racks, marking the temperature reading in the ledger. At 9 o'clock, she climbed to her own sleeping space and lay in the dark listening to Tobias's breathing, find the slow rhythm of someone who had stopped fighting exhaustion. Below them both, the sheep breathed in the steady tide they kept filling the barn with warmth that the walls were already holding. She opened the ledger one final time. He is here now. All I need is time. The first real test of these walls is coming, and neither of us knows yet what this winter will decide. She closed the book, blew out the lamp, and lay in the dark, while the temperature outside continued its descent towards something the basin had never yet produced in any of the 6 mild winters Calhoun Briggs cited as proof that his approach to the cold was sound. 3 days away was a night that would produce numbers she would underline with enough pressure to score the page beneath. But that was 3 days away, and the present held only the breathing of animals that were warm a boy in the loft above, who had returned not because he believed in what she had built, but because the cold had given him no other option, and the wool walls standing patient in the November dark, doing precisely the work they had been built to do, indifferent to every opinion the basin had formed about them. The silence that woke Ingrid on the night of November 12th was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of something that had stopped a presence removed rather than an absence maintained, and she lay in the loft with her eyes open in the dark for several seconds before understanding what had changed. The wind had stopped. For the first time in 3 weeks, the air outside the barn held perfectly still, and in that stillness, the cold had descended with a weight she could feel pressing through the roof boards above her, as though the sky itself had lowered onto the structure. She dressed in the dark, moving by feel through the sequence she had established over the past weeks. Wool stockings first, then the heavy flannel shirt, then the canvas trousers she wore for barn work, then the coat she kept on a peg at the loft edge, so her hands found it without searching. She climbed down the ladder with the lantern lit at the bottom rung, and the first thing she registered was the quality of the air in the main stable space. Not cold, not the regulated warmth of a heated building, but the warmth of living bodies in an insulated space, organic, faintly sweet with hay and animal breath, the temperature of something alive rather than something maintained. The sheep lay in their straw with their legs folded beneath them. The two milk cows stood side by side near the hay rack, chewing with the patient rhythm of animals who had no particular reason to hurry. Corbin the mule slept standing with one ear forward and one ear back, dreaming of whatever mules dream when they are fed and warm and not being asked to pull anything. Ingrid walked to the main entrance, opened the inner door of the vestibule, stepped into the buffer space between the two sets of doors, and felt the temperature change immediately cooler in the vestibule. Not cold, the transition that told her the outer door was doing its job. She opened the outer door. The cold hit her face with the force of something that did not negotiate. She held the lantern up to the thermometer she had mounted at eye level on the outer door frame 6 weeks earlier, when the frame was still green wood, and she had worried it might shrink away from the casing. The mercury stood at negative 17 degrees Fahrenheit. She stepped back inside, closed the outer door with care, crossed the vestibule, and checked the interior thermometer mounted at the same height on the opposite wall. 34 degrees above zero. 51 degrees of difference between the inside of her wool walls and the air outside them, produced by nothing except the body heat of 40 sheep and 2 cows and 1 mule captured by 8 inches of raw, greasy fleece, packed to the density her grandmother's hand had taught hers to recognize. The laugh that came out of her was not a polite sound. It came up from somewhere below planning or intention, the kind of laugh that has been waiting for months to be earned, and it filled the stable with a noise the sheep had not heard before. Several of them lifted their heads, assessed the situation, decided it did not require further investigation, and put their heads back down. Above her, the loft boards creaked. Tobias's face appeared at the edge, lit from below by the lantern, squinting down at her with the expression of a boy pulled from deep sleep by an unexpected sound. "What is it?" The irritation in his voice was fresh and unguarded, stripped of the deliberate distance he maintained during daylight hours. Ingrid pointed at the 2 thermometers, the one behind her through the vestibule, the one on the wall 3 feet from where she stood. 51 degrees, no fire. Tobias looked at the interior thermometer. He looked at the frost forming on the outside edges of the vestibule door frame, visible even from the loft against the complete absence of frost on the interior surfaces. He looked at the sheep breathing in their straw. He said nothing. No sarcasm, no dismissal, nothing that would have been easy. He simply looked at the numbers for a long moment, then pulled his head back into the loft and lay down again. The boards above her settled into silence. She stood alone among her animals for another minute, holding the lantern in the 51-degree air. 3 miles north, she knew Calhoun Briggs's cattle stood on the open range in negative 17 degrees, with nothing between them and the sky. She opened her ledger on the hay bale where she had left it the previous evening. In the column she had set aside for temperature differentials, she wrote outside minus 17, inside plus 34, difference 51 degrees. No fuel. Beneath the numbers, she drew a single line and wrote 2 words, "It works." The daily rhythm that settled in during the second week of November was defined by animals and cold in a proportion that shifted as December approached. Ingrid's morning began before daylight down the ladder through the stable circuit, forking hay into feeding racks, breaking the thin skin of ice that formed overnight on the water trough. Despite the barn's warmth, mucking stalls into a wheelbarrow, she emptied into the composting pile behind the south wall. She checked each sheep individually for the early signs of foot rot, respiratory distress, any condition that would spread through a confined flock before it announced itself visibly. The ridge vent required attention every morning, not because it failed, but because its function was delicate enough to need verification. Without the vent, the animal's breath would condense on the cold interior surfaces, wick into the wool in the walls, and compromise the insulation from the inside. The vent allowed moisture to escape upward, while the warm air, lighter than the cold air above the roof, rose only as far as the insulated ceiling and settled back down. The balance required daily confirmation. What Ingrid had not anticipated was Tobias. The boy who had refused to touch the wooden paddle in August began somewhere in the second week of November to participate. Not to help in any way she had not requested anything but to begin recording the temperature readings in her ledger. She came down one morning to find the dawn entry already written in his handwriting, precise and upright, the numbers aligned with the column headers as neatly as if he had been doing it for months. She did not comment. He did not explain. The satchel with the ledger continued to sit on the hay bale near the ladder each evening, and each morning it contained 4 entries in the same careful hand. The trail to Briggs Ranch broke apart in the third week of November when a heavy snowfall buried the fence posts that served as trail markers across the open ground. Without those posts visible above the drift surface, a rider could wander into a hollow, lose orientation in blowing snow, and not find the way back before exposure became dangerous. Tobias stopped attempting the ride. He was trapped in the barn and in the dugout, and he knew it. And for the first 3 days of that confinement, he expressed his awareness of it through the ceiling of the loft, lying on his back, staring upward, with the misery of a young person who believes circumstances have imprisoned him rather than protected him. But a 16-year-old boy, surrounded by living animals in a confined space, will eventually reach for something to do. The ledger was there. The thermometers were there. Recording numbers required no conversation with the woman he was not yet ready to forgive for being alive when his father was not. And so he recorded numbers, and the act of recording numbers 4 times each day meant that 4 times each day he climbed down the ladder, walked through the stable space, stood at the interior thermometer, then walked to the vestibule and read the exterior one. The animals registered his presence and adjusted to it. The sheep learned his smell. Corbin the mule began turning an ear toward him when he entered from the loft side of the building, a kind of casual acknowledgement that Tobias seemed to find less burdensome than the acknowledgments of people. By the end of November, he had taken over the dawn and midnight readings entirely. Ingrid noticed that he had begun to linger after the midnight entries, standing at the base of the ladder in the dark, with the lantern turned low, not doing anything, just occupying the space where the animal slept and breathed around him. She never spoke to him during these moments. She kept her breathing slow and even in the loft above, and she wondered whether the boy was beginning to understand something that could not be argued into him, that the warmth surrounding him was not accidental, not the result of luck or season or some mild exemption granted by the weather, but the consequence of a decision made by a specific person using specific knowledge, and that the decision had been made by someone whose judgment he had spent 4 months refusing. After 2 weeks, he noticed what the numbers showed when arranged in sequence. One morning, after recording an exterior reading of -23 and an interior reading of +29, he set the ledger on the hay bale and looked at Ingrid across the feeding rack with a question that had the quality of something he had been resisting asking. Why does the differential hold at roughly 50 degrees no matter what the outside temperature does? She did not explain. She had made a decision early in November before he arrived back that she would show rather than tell that telling had not worked with anyone in this basin. Not with Briggs, not with Crane, not with Voss. And there was no reason to believe it would work with a 16-year-old boy who had spent the autumn being educated by the man who laughed at her construction loudest. She walked him to the interior wall at the south end of the stable and placed his palm flat against the pine sheathing. Feel that. Warm, he said with the caution of someone not sure what he is being led toward. She walked him through the vestibule past both sets of doors and placed his palm against the outer sheathing. He pulled his hand back almost immediately, not startled, simply recoiling from the cold that had penetrated the outer skin of the wall. He looked at his hand, then at the wall, measuring the distance between the two surfaces with his eyes. 8 inches. His expression shifted in a way she recognized as the beginning of understanding, not yet arrived but approaching. She went back inside and returned to forking hay. He stood at the outer wall for another moment, looking at his hand in the gray morning light, then followed her in without speaking. Wade Dunmore arrived in the third week of November with the wagon load of hay Ingrid had contracted from him in October, driving carefully through drift channels his horses had learned to navigate. He unloaded the hay into the south storage section with the methodical efficiency of someone who has done physical work for a living, long enough that it no longer requires conscious direction, then spent an hour moving through the barn the way he had moved through it in September, slowly checking specific things, the kind of inspection that produces conclusions rather than impressions. He tested the ventilation by holding a strip of cloth near the ridge vent and watching the gentle upward draw. He examined the door gaskets, pressing them with his thumb to feel the compression. He stood on the barn floor in the center of the stable space and simply held still. The way a man with years of construction experience holds still inside a structure to feel whether it is behaving the way it was built to behave. When he finally came outside into the cold, he stood with one hand on the doorframe and spoke with the directness that characterized everything he said. "Mrs. Halverson, your sheep are warmer in there than I am in my own house." He paused, looking at the sky above the basin with the habit of a man who reads weather for practical purposes. "I need to tell you something. Harlan Voss has been talking in Gravel Ford since October. He says if this winter passes without serious losses on the open range, he will petition the Territorial Council in Bismarck to prohibit what he calls foreign construction methods on public grazing land. He is telling people your barn is a fire hazard because of the wool in the walls." Ingrid felt the ground shift in a way that had nothing to do with frost heave. She had prepared herself for ridicule. She had absorbed Briggs's certainty, Crane's theology, the newspaper article, Tobias's contempt. She had not prepared for this. Voss was not a man with an opinion. Voss was a man with connections to the territorial legislature, relationships with the cattle associations in Bismarck, and the combination of wealth and conviction that could convert a personal grievance into a regulatory fact. "Could you speak for me?" she asked. "Before the council, you understand the principles." Dunmore shook his head once slowly. "I'm a freighter, Mrs. Halverson. I haul wire fencing and flour sacks between Gravel Ford and the line camps. A council of territorial ranchers and their representatives does not wait for my testimony." He looked at her with the level honesty of someone who had learned to deliver difficult assessments without softening them into uselessness. "I'm telling you so you can think about it. What Voss does in Bismarck matters more if the winter is mild and his cattle are fine. If the winter is not mild, the conversation changes." They stood together in the cold light and neither of them spoke for a time. There was nothing comfortable to say. Both of them were people who understood things that the territory's decision-makers had not asked them to understand, and both of them were going to be asked to accept whatever those decision-makers decided regardless. That evening, Ingrid wrote in the ledger, "If the winter is mild, Voss will destroy what I have built through legislation. If the winter is severe, Voss will lose his cattle. I want neither outcome. I get to choose neither." The temperature dropped through December with the consistency of a mathematical function. Each week colder than the last, each night colder than the week before. Ingrid recorded her 4 daily readings without variation inside differential time. The differential held between 45 and 55 degrees across every reading, regardless of what the exterior thermometer showed. At -10, the interior held near 40 above. At -20, it settled around 32. At -25, still above freezing. The wool walls did not perform differently on different days. They performed the same way every day, with the reliability of a physical law rather than a construction technique, because what they embodied was in fact a physical law. Still air is an insulator, raw lanolin. Bearing fiber traps, still air trapped. Still air resists temperature differential, and physical laws do not take days off. Briggs rode into Gravel Ford in the second week of December with a face that had aged noticeably since September. He reported to the men gathered around the general store stove that he had lost 40 head, already mostly young calves and older cows that lacked the body reserves to carry them through persistent cold. The cattle were not freezing outright. They were starving slowly. The deep frost had locked the prairie grass beneath an ice crust the animals could not break through, and Briggs had not stored anything close to sufficient hay to feed 400 head through what was clearly going to be a winter of a different character than the previous 6. The cattle were burning through their own reserves to fuel their metabolism, and when the reserves were depleted, they would simply lie down in the snow and not stand again. Ingrid heard these reports at the Saturday gatherings at the cooperative store in Gravel Ford, where ranchers came to buy supplies and share information in voices that grew quieter with each passing week. She listened without commenting, made her purchases, drove her wagon back to the barn with the attention to her team that icy ground demanded. She did not say she had predicted this. She did not say anything that could be heard as a verdict. The animals in her wool barn were gaining weight. The sheep, given regular hay in a heated space without the caloric cost of maintaining body temperature in negative temperatures, were thriving in the precise meaning of the word, their condition improving rather than merely holding. The encounter at the Gravel Ford General Store happened in the second week of December on a Saturday when Tobias had driven in with her to help load supplies. The store was crowded with ranchers whose expressions carried the flatness of men who have begun absorbing losses they cannot afford. Briggs was there near the cast iron stove, and when he spotted Tobias across the room, his voice found the public register it used when performing for an audience. Boy, those sheep your stepmother keeps in that wool box, they alive still, or did they suffocate in all that fleece? A scatter of tired laughter moved through the room. Tobias stood near the dry goods counter with his hands in his coat pockets, and for a moment he was absolutely still, the stillness of someone who is choosing rather than reacting. 3 months earlier, that laugh would have bent him. 3 months earlier, he had been a boy who needed Briggs's approval badly enough to ride through early winter cold every morning to earn it. 3 months of temperature readings 4 times a day had produced a different kind of knowing, the knowledge that does not require an argument because it lives in numbers on a page. His voice when he spoke was quiet enough that the room had to stop to hear it. Her animals are not dying. Yours are. The laughter stopped. The room held the silence that follows when something true has been said, in a space full of people who knew it but hadn't said it. Briggs's jaw worked without producing language. Several men looked at Tobias with the involuntary respect that a true statement earns when an adult should have said it first. Ingrid was standing near the canned goods shelf. She heard every word. Her hands were not entirely steady, though not from cold. No one spoke for several seconds. Then conversations resumed quieter than before, and Tobias walked out of the store without looking at anyone. Ingrid paid for her supplies and followed a few minutes later, finding him seated on the wagon bench with his collar turned up and his gaze on the middle distance. She climbed up, gathered the reins, released the brake. The runners hissed through the packed snow on the track out of town. They drove in silence for the first mile. The mule, not Corbin, who was stabled, but the rented town mule she had borrowed for the supply run, leaned into the traces with the resignation of an animal that has accepted the world's terms without enthusiasm. Tobias spoke first without turning his head. I didn't say it for you. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. I know. I said it because it was true. Their animals are dying and yours are not. That is arithmetic, not loyalty. I know that too. He was quiet for another quarter mile. The cold was sharp enough to make each breath visible small brief clouds that disappeared before the next one formed. Then still facing forward. But if it had not been true, I would not have said it. She understood precisely what he was offering. Not allegiance, not reconciliation, not the erasure of September or the months of deliberate absence. He was telling her that the evidence had become too heavy to carry in the direction he had been carrying it, that a boy educated in a Minnesota church school could not stand in a room full of men and allow a false thing to go unchallenged when the true thing was living and breathing 3 miles away in a barn that every man in that room had called worthless. She did not thank him. He did not expect to be thanked. Something had shifted between them that was as real as the temperature differential in the barn measurable if you had the right instrument, and both of them felt it settle into place without requiring a ceremony. The great cold arrived in 2 stages, as the worst winters often do. The first stage a declaration, the second a sentence. The declaration came on the 8th of January, when an Arctic air mass moved down from the northern plains with the finality of something that had been building for months and had finally decided to stop being patient. The temperature at Gravel Ford dropped to negative 44 degrees by sunrise on the 9th of January and did not recover. Day after day, the thermometers across the basin recorded readings between 30 and 52 below zero, with the lowest numbers appearing on the still, windless nights when the sky was clear and the stars carried the cold brightness of light, traveling through something very dense. Ingrid came down from the loft on the morning of the 11th of January and made her readings with deliberate care, the way a person in a critical situation makes their most important observations. Outside negative 48, inside positive 26. She stood looking at those numbers for a long time. 74 degrees of difference. No fire. She wrote them in the ledger with the steadiness of someone who understands they are recording something that will matter, and beneath the numbers, she wrote a single word. Grandmother. Nothing else. The word said everything that needed to be said about where the knowledge had come from and to whom the credit belonged, and what it meant that 3 generations of Norwegian women passing information through their hands had produced this number on a January morning in Dakota Territory. Outside, the cold was killing on a scale that no living person in the basin had witnessed. Cattle that had been weakened by 3 weeks of extreme cold now found themselves unable to reach any food at all. The January snowfall that began on the 25th added catastrophic layers to an already lethal situation. 16 days of continuous snowfall, driven by winds that gusted to 60 miles per hour, accumulating drifts of 15 feet against any vertical structure, burying every fence post and landmark, transforming the prairie into a featureless white surface, as hard as a tabletop where it was wind-packed and as treacherous as open water where it was not. Hay supplies that had been rationed carefully through December ran out. There was no neighbor close enough to borrow from, no railroad delivery fast enough, no government mechanism for relief. The cattle began dying in numbers that would not be counted until spring, when the snow retreated and revealed what January had decided. In the third week of January, with the exterior thermometer holding near -41, of the ewes went into labor. Ingrid had been watching her for 2 days. The restlessness, the way she separated herself from the flock, and repeatedly pawed at her bedding, the specific displacement behavior of an animal approaching parturition. Tobias noticed it on the morning of the 21st and asked what was happening with the directness he had developed over the weeks of barn work. She told him what it meant, including what it would mean if the animal were outside. Newborn lambs cannot regulate their own body temperature for the first several days of life. At -20 degrees, a lamb born outdoors would be dead within an hour, regardless of how closely the mother held it. The critical window, the first hour of life in which the lamb needs to stand, find the teat nurse, ingest colostrum, required temperatures above freezing to be survivable without extraordinary intervention. The inside of the wool barn was holding at 30 degrees above zero. The lamb would have 30 degrees above zero to begin its life in. The ewe delivered twin lambs late that afternoon. The first came without complication. The second presented in a breech position, and Ingrid guided it with her hands, working with the precision and calm her grandmother had demonstrated on sheep in Telemark when Ingrid was a child, watching from a corner of the barn. Tobias stood behind her, holding the lantern, his face carrying the pallor of someone confronting something they had not previously understood was possible. But his hands were steady, and the light was steady, and the lamb came out into the air of the wool barn and began to move. The first lamb was on its feet within 30 minutes, unsteady but purposeful. The second took nearly an hour, wobbling on legs that seemed disproportionately long for its body, making false starts toward the teat and then losing direction until something resolved in its coordination, and it latched on and nursed with the single-minded intensity of a creature discovering that the world contains what it needs. Both lambs were alive. Both lambs were breathing. The temperature outside was -41 degrees. The temperature inside the wool barn was 30 degrees above zero. Tobias set the lantern on a hay bale and lowered himself onto an overturned bucket and looked at the lambs pressed against their mother's flank. He sat that way for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet and entirely without the layers of performance that had characterized his speech since August. "Your grandmother, she was right." Ingrid folded the cloth she had used during the delivery. She was always right. She did not say more than that. The moment did not require more. A boy who had spent 5 months refusing to acknowledge what existed directly in front of him had finally seen it. Not because he had been argued into it, not because the evidence had been presented to him in any formal way, but because he had watched two lives begin in a space that had no right to be warm enough to receive them, except that it was because a woman had spent 7 months of her life making it that way. 4 miles to the north, Harlan Voss's cattle operation was dying. The numbers that would emerge in spring were not yet known, but the shape of the disaster was already clear to anyone who rode the range. Animals that had survived the initial cold by burning their own reserves were now encountering the snowfall with nothing left to burn. They drifted downwind until they found a fence, or a coulee, or a structure to drift against, and there they stood in the lee of whatever partial shelter the landscape offered, and they died standing up when their reserves exhausted themselves, and the snow continued to fall and cover them, and the drifts grew over the places where they had stood, until the prairie looked unbroken and white and gave no indication of what it contained. On the 8th of February, Calhoun Briggs rode to Ingrid's gate through drifts that came to his horse's chest. The horse was laboring. Briggs himself looked as though he had not slept in a week, his face hollow in the cheekbones, his eyes red-rimmed from wind exposure. His voice, when he called out to her, carrying a quality she had not heard in it, before the quality of a man who has run out of the resources his certainty had been borrowing against. He had lost more than half his herd. The surviving cattle, perhaps 60 head, were gathered at his line shack and dying because the wind came straight through the cottonwood walls of the structure, as though the boards were decorative. He had heard that her animals were alive. He had come to ask whether she could take some of his breeding cows. Just the best ones. Just the ones he needed to start again in spring. She looked at him. She looked at the man who had sat on his horse in July and lectured her about wool being a commodity, about mice and moths, about the Lord's provision being sufficient for animals that had not been pampered out of their natural toughness. She looked at the man who had given Tobias his first cowboy hat and filled the boy's autumn with the certainty that his stepmother was a figure of regional comedy. She searched herself for satisfaction and found nothing there. Only a deep and unfamiliar sadness for the animals that had died because their owner had been too confident in what he already knew to consider that someone else might know something he did not. "I cannot watch any more of them die," his voice barely holding. "Mrs. Halverson, I cannot watch more of them die." Tobias appeared in the barn doorway behind her. He looked at Briggs, the man who had given him the hat, the man who was now begging with an expression that had aged past 16 in a way that could not be undone. He stepped forward. "She will take your cattle. I will clear the hay storage at the south end tonight." Ingrid looked at Tobias. She nodded. "Bring them tomorrow," she told Briggs. "As many as you can move through the snow." 23 cows arrived the next afternoon. Briggs had worked through the night with 3 of his remaining hands to break a trail through the drifts. 2 animals died on the way and were left where they fell. The surviving 23 were guided through Ingrid's gate, through the cleared path Tobias had made into the south end of the barn, where the hay storage had been emptied and fresh bedding laid. When the doors closed behind them and the felt gaskets compressed against the frames, the cattle stood in the unfamiliar warmth for a long time, swaying slightly on legs that had carried them 4 miles through chest-deep snow. Within an hour, 2 of them had lain down. Within 3 hours, all 23 were either resting in the bedding or eating from the hay racks Ingrid had filled, and the temperature in the south section rose perceptibly as the additional body heat joined the existing warmth, and the wool walls absorbed it and held it the way they held everything, without fanfare or exception. What followed was a week that Ingrid would remember longer than the cold itself. Colton Fenton arrived on the 11th with the family's milk cow and the small horse his daughter Greer loved, both animals thin and shaking, and Ingrid took them in without discussion. On the 13th, Garrett Finch came down the trail from the north with 35 surviving sheep from his original flock of 200. He had carried 3 of the weakest on his shoulders during the last mile, their legs draped across his back, because they had gone down in the snow and he had not been able to leave them. His hands were white when he arrived. His feet had lost feeling. Tobias saw him coming from the barn window and ran out to open the gate, helping carry the last ewe inside, before either of them spoke. Reverend Aldous Crane came on the 14th of February with 2 families from Gravel Ford behind him. A carpenter named Webb with his wife and 3 children, a farrier named Packard with his wife and 2 sons. The families had been burning furniture for heat and were approaching the end of what furniture they had. Crane stood at the gate with his hat held in both hands before his chest, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the assured authority it had carried in August. "I know that I have no right to ask you anything, Mrs. Halverson. I said things to you last summer that I should not have said, but these families are in danger of freezing in their homes. Your barn is warmer than any structure within 50 miles, and I am asking you to shelter them until the weather changes." She looked at him. She looked at the children behind him, bundled in every piece of clothing their parents could fit onto them, their faces red from the walk through the cold, their eyes carrying the alertness of children who understand that something serious is happening, even if they cannot name it precisely. She looked at Crane, the man who had told her that protecting her livestock was a failure of faith. "Bring them in," she told him. Crane's shoulders dropped, a small collapse, almost involuntary. He was not quite bowing, but it was close. "I will not forget this," he said. "I will not forget it either, Reverend," she replied, "but not for the reason you think." By the 3rd week of February, Ingrid Halverson was sheltering her own 40 sheep, her 2 milk cows, her mule, her chickens, 23 of Briggs's breeding cows, the Fenton family's milk cow and their daughter's horse, 35 of Finch's surviving sheep, the carpenter's family, the farrier's family, and Garrett Finch himself, who had taken up residence in the tack room and proved a calm and skilled presence during the lambing that was now occurring regularly in the south section. The population of the wool barn stood at nearly 120 animals and 11 human beings. The temperature inside held at 45 degrees during the daylight hours and 40 at night. Not a single animal that crossed her threshold died inside her walls. The barn that Harlan Voss had called a coffin for sheep had become the only warm place in Flint Rock Basin. The only reason it could perform this function was that a woman had spent the previous summer doing precisely what every person she encountered had advised her not to do. Late on a night when both families were settled on their loft pallets, when Finch had completed his lambing rounds, when Tobias had fallen asleep with the ledger open on his chest, Ingrid stood alone in the center of the stable. She looked at the sleeping animals, at the sleeping people, at the wool walls, holding them all in warmth, while the territory outside continued its work. She opened the ledger to a clean page. "Grandmother," she wrote, "you told me wool holds warmth where warmth has no right to exist. You forgot to tell me that warmth is not only temperature." She closed the book. Above her, the wind pressed against the roof. The wool pressed back. Inside that 8-inch margin of trapped still air, more than 100 lives continued breathing through the worst winter the northern plains had ever produced. The warm wind came down from the Black Hills on the 17th of February, like a pardon issued by no particular authority. It arrived in the pre-dawn hours as a pressure change, more than a sound, a shift in the quality of the silence outside the barn walls, something loosening in the air that had been locked for 6 weeks. Ingrid felt it before she heard it. She had been sleeping lightly for days, in the way of someone who has been managing a crisis long enough that her nervous system no longer fully trusted the absence of emergency, and when the pressure changed, she was awake before she could identify why. She dressed, climbed down, made her rounds. The animals registered the change before she confirmed it with the thermometer, a restlessness in the sheep, a lifting of heads. Corbin shifting his weight from one hip to the other in the way he did when something in the air told him the world outside was reconsidering its terms. She opened the outer vestibule door and stepped outside for the first time in 4 days without bracing for something that would try to take her breath away by force. The cold was still present, still well below freezing, still enough to redden exposed skin in minutes. But it had lost the killing edge that had defined every breath since early January, the edge that turned moisture to ice before it could fall, that made the air feel like something with intentions. The temperature on the outer thermometer read -12. 3 weeks ago, that number would have felt like relief. This morning, it felt like the beginning of a thaw that was not yet complete, but was no longer reversible. The temperature would continue to swing for weeks. The snow would not meaningfully melt until April. But the Arctic air mass had lifted its decision from the basin, and the decision it left behind was this: what had survived until the 17th of February would continue to survive. Garrett Finch came out of the tack room when he heard her moving. He stood beside her in the doorway for a minute without speaking, both of them looking at the sky above the white basin, where a line of pale color at the eastern horizon was doing something it had not done in weeks, brightening with actual purpose, rather than simply lightening to a slightly less dark gray. Finch pressed his lips together, lifted his gaze toward whatever he addressed in moments like this, crossed himself with the quiet economy of a man for whom the gesture is private, rather than performed. He said something low enough that she caught only the tone, which was the tone of a person returning something borrowed. The two families from Gravel Ford left that same day, making their way back along the trail Tobias had kept open with daily shoveling, the children wrapped in blankets Ingrid had pressed on them before they walked out. The carpenter Webb stopped at the gate and shook her hand with the grip of a man who understands he is paying a debt that cannot actually be settled in handshakes. The farrier Packard could not speak at all. He stood at the gate for a moment with his wife and his 2 sons, looked at Ingrid, touched the brim of his hat, and walked away with his family across the white ground. She watched them grow small against the landscape and thought about how strange it was that these people had spent 2 weeks inside her walls without once asking how the walls worked. Calhoun Briggs came for his cattle on a Tuesday in the first week of March, arriving with 3 of the hands he had managed to keep through the winter on a reduced arrangement. The trail between the properties had consolidated enough under the Chinook to support horses without drifting, and the 23 breeding cows walked out of the south end of the barn on legs that had strengthened over 3 weeks of regular hay in a warm space. They moved differently than they had arrived, not the lurching, swaying exhaustion of animals stripped to their last reserves, but the easy, unhurried movement of cattle that had been given time to recover. Briggs watched them file through the gate with an expression that underwent several changes in quick succession before settling into something that had no performance in it at all. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. His voice, when it came, had been stripped of the authority it had carried for every conversation she had ever had with him. "Mrs. Halverson, I owe you more than money can settle. You were right, and I was wrong, and my being wrong killed 340 cattle that would still be alive if I had listened to you last July. I owe you an apology in front of anyone who will hear it." She looked at him for a long time. She saw a man who had been broken down to something simpler than what he had been and who was trying to build back up from that simpler thing into something better. She recognized the effort, having made a version of it herself after Eric died. "You were not wrong because you didn't know, Mr. Briggs. You were wrong because you didn't ask." He held her gaze for a moment, then put his hat back on with the deliberateness of someone accepting a verdict. He gathered his cattle and drove them north toward what remained of his operation. He would rebuild with fewer than 200 head. Every structure he erected for the rest of his working life would have wool batting in its walls. He lived until 1908, and in the Flint Rock Basin he was known in his later years as the man who had the honesty to say without qualification that Ingrid Halverson had taught him what he should have been willing to learn in the summer of 1886. Garrett Finch left with his 35 surviving sheep on the same Tuesday. He had lost 165 animals, more than 80% of the flock he had built over 2 decades of careful breeding. The sheep that remained were alive because he had made the decision to bring them to her barn on the 13th of February, a decision he had nearly reversed twice during the walk through the drifts, the walk during which he had carried 3 of the weakest animals across his back, rather than leave them behind. He stood in the yard with his bedroll over one shoulder before the flock was gathered, and he reached inside his coat and produced a pair of wool shears. Sheffield steel with handles worn to a dark smoothness by decades of use. The blades still held an edge that could separate fleece from skin in a single practice pass. He extended them toward her without ceremony, because ceremony would have been wrong for what he was trying to say. She took them in both hands. They were heavier than she had expected, warm from his body, balanced in a way that spoke of generations of refinement by craftsmen who understood that a tool used daily for a working life needed to disappear into the hand that used it. She understood what she was holding. These were not a gift in the way that objects given out of surplus are gifts. These were the thing that stood between Finch and destitution, the instrument of his livelihood passed to her because she had preserved the flock that made the livelihood possible. "You saved what I had left to save," his voice carrying the flatness of someone speaking around something they cannot let into their throat, "and that is everything." She could not speak for a moment. She held the shears in both hands and thought about the chain of women's hands that had produced the knowledge those shears had just been offered in gratitude for Astrid's mother's hands. Astrid's hands, her own hands, pressing into wool walls in the summer heat of a Dakota construction site, while men on horseback delivered opinions about mice and moths. Finch embraced her briefly, the embrace of a man who does not embrace people as a general practice, fierce in its brevity. Then he gathered his sheep and walked south along the creek toward his own claim. She kept those shears for the rest of her life. They hung on a nail beside the barn door, and she used them every shearing season without exception. And every time she took them down, she thought about a man who had carried dying lambs through chest-deep snow because he could not bring himself to leave them in the drift where they had gone down. Harlan Voss collected his 8 breeding bulls near the end of the first week of March, arriving alone rather than with the foreman who had accompanied him on his September visit. The bulls were in significantly better condition than they had arrived 3 weeks of hay in a 40-degree space had done for them. What 3 weeks on an open range in -40 never could have. Voss walked through the south end of the barn without speaking, checking each animal with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 30 years assessing cattle, running his hands along their spines, checking their hip condition, looking at their eyes. When he was satisfied, he began moving them toward the gate. She had not expected an apology from him. The architecture of his character, the specific combination of self-made authority, physical scale, territorial influence, and 3 decades of unchallenged judgment did not produce apologies. The same qualities that had built a 4,000-head operation were the qualities that prevented him from saying the 2 words that Briggs had managed. She had understood this about him since September, the way you understand weather as a condition, rather than a choice, something to account for, rather than argue with. He stopped at the gate with his back to her and his face toward the open range, where his cattle had died by the thousands, the range that was still white and featureless, still covering what January had done to it, the full accounting still weeks away in the spring thaw. His voice when it came was quiet enough that she had to stand still to hear it. I called this place a coffin. It was the only thing left alive. Then he walked on, leading his bulls north, and those were the last words he ever spoke to her directly. She learned what remained of his story in pieces over the years that followed. He never recovered the financial position the winter had destroyed. The cattle associations he had leveraged for credit held notes against animals that no longer existed, and the Eastern investors who had funded the great Flint Rock Basin enterprises pulled their capital out of the territory with the speed of people who have realized they did not understand what they had invested in. Voss sold his rangeland to settle his creditors and spent his remaining years working as a clerk in the Bismarck stockyards, the same yards where he had once been one of the largest consignors. He died in 1894 in a rented room alone. The last thing he was reported to have said to anyone spoken to a fellow clerk on an ordinary afternoon at the shipping desk was this: "I had 4,000 cattle and not one wall. Now I have walls all around me and not one cow." The man who heard it did not understand what it meant. But Ingrid would have understood, and Briggs would have understood, and Wade Dunmore would have understood, because all of them had lived through the same winter and come out the other side knowing that the line between prosperity and ruin had been exactly 8 inches of raw wool placed there by someone the territory had laughed at. Colton Fenton came for his milk cow and his daughter's horse on a bright afternoon, paying for 3 weeks of shelter with a side of beef from the animals his family had managed to keep. His daughter Greer, 9 years old, with the direct gaze of a child who has been frightened recently and decided not to remain frightened, led the horse out of the barn, then turned and ran back inside and wrapped both arms around Ingrid's waist without announcing this intention. She stood there for a long moment without speaking. Ingrid had sewn a small wool blanket for the child during the long February evenings, cutting it from a remnant of the batting material left over from the wall construction, hemming it with the careful stitches Astrid had taught her. She draped it over Greer's shoulders as the girl finally released her and walked away with her horse. Ingrid watched her cross the yard and thought about the unbroken line of hands teaching other hands. Astrid's mother's hands to Astrid's hands to hers, and now hers placing a wool blanket on a child in Dakota territory who would carry some version of this winter for the rest of her life without knowing all of what had made it survivable. Delia Marsh arrived in April when the last of the snow was retreating into the coulées and the first pale green was appearing at ground level in the places where the sun reached longest. She came alone on horseback, the leather satchel across her shoulder containing what she had spent 6 weeks writing. She stood at the gate and held the satchel out before Ingrid could speak. "I wrote the first article the way my editor wanted it. This one I wrote the way it needed to be written." The manuscript was 12 pages in Delia's small, precise hand. It was nothing like the piece the Tribune had published in October. It described the construction of the wool barn in technical language that treated the subject as serious engineering rather than frontier eccentricity. It reported the temperature differentials Ingrid had recorded throughout the winter, the specific numbers on specific dates, the physical principles that explained them. It documented every animal that had entered the barn and survived set against the losses on the open range, the numbers that were still being tallied as the snow retreated, the staggering arithmetic of what January had cost the territory. It named Briggs and Voss and their September pronouncements. It quoted them with precision. It concluded with a statement that Delia had written and rewritten 6 times before she was satisfied, that the foundational assumption of the open-range cattle industry had been proven catastrophically wrong by the worst winter in the memory of the American West, and that the correction had come from a Norwegian immigrant widow whose methods had been mocked, dismissed, publicly ridiculed, and then desperately needed by every man who had done the mocking and dismissing. Ingrid read it standing in the yard, her shadow long in the April morning light. She corrected 2 technical details about the floor assembly. The felt thickness she had used was 3 inches, not 2, and the distinction mattered for anyone trying to replicate the construction. She corrected 1 detail about the ridge vent configuration. Then she looked up. "Did you speak with Wade Dunmore?" Delia had her notebook out. "I spoke with him last week. He told me about his father's construction practice in Pennsylvania. I've included it. He understood the principles before anyone here was willing to hear them. His voice belongs in this." Delia wrote something in the notebook. "The piece names him." Ingrid handed back the manuscript. then send it. The article encountered resistance at the Tribune, where the editor expressed reluctance to publish a piece that essentially told his readership they had been fools. Delia's account of that conversation relayed to Ingrid in a letter that arrived in June was brief. The editor had said that people did not want to read that they were wrong. Delia had replied that 1.5 million cattle were dead in the northern plains, and the readers already knew they were wrong. What they did not have was the information to do differently. The piece ran in the summer of 1888 under a headline considerably less entertaining than its predecessor. It was not read as widely as the original article because corrections never travel as far as the errors they address. But it was the first time a major territorial newspaper had publicly acknowledged that the open-range system's foundational assumption had failed, and that the person who had been right about it was a woman the paper had previously invited its readers to laugh at. Reverend Aldous Crane preached a sermon on Easter Sunday of 1887 that divided his congregation in a way that the division itself was the point. He stood at the pulpit of the small-frame church in Gravel Ford for 40 minutes, and the core of what he said was this. The previous summer, he had told a woman that protecting her animals with wool insulation represented a failure of trust in divine provision. The winter had demonstrated with a finality that foreclosed debate that God had furnished wool with its particular properties for precisely the purpose that woman had used it for. The arrogance, Crane said, had not been in building walls. The arrogance had been in believing you understood the mind of God when what you actually understood was the boundary of your own habits. He had confused faith with assumption, and that confusion had cost animals their lives, had cost families their futures, and he would carry it as a burden for the remainder of his ministry. Half the congregation nodded. The other half looked at their hands or at the floor or at the space above the pulpit where they did not have to meet anyone's eyes. One of Voss's former foremen stood up in the back row and walked out without closing the door behind him, and the April wind that came through the open door moved the pages of the hymnals on the pew racks with a sound like something briefly released. Iris Fenton, sitting near the front with Colton and their daughter Greer, reached across the pew and took her husband's hand. Colton looked at his wife, then at the pulpit, then at his hands, and he was among the people who nodded. Crane never became a close friend of Ingrid's. The distance between what he had said in August and what he had said in April was too specific a distance to be fully bridged. But he never repeated the mistake, and in the years that followed, he was occasionally heard telling people newly arrived in the territory that if they wanted to understand how to build for a Dakota winter, they should ride out to the Halverson place and ask the woman there to explain her walls. He kept a small piece of raw fleece on his desk in the parsonage for the rest of his career, and when visitors asked about it, he told them it was a reminder of a lesson he had earned the hard way. The piece of fleece was still on his desk when he retired in 1901. The method spread with the speed of knowledge that has been proven by disaster. By autumn of 1887, Briggs had begun construction of a wool-insulated cattle barn on his rebuilt operations, scaling Ingrid's basic design upward to accommodate the smaller herd he was rebuilding from his surviving cows. He hired Ingrid to supervise the cavity-filling phase because he had watched her pack the fleece in the original construction and understood that the density was not a matter of approximation. It was the difference between a wall that worked and a wall that merely looked like it worked. She walked the line of studs as the hands packed the fleece, pressing each section with her palm, feeling for the yield that was neither too soft nor too stiff, pulling out handfuls in the places that were packed too tight, adding material in the places that were too loose. Briggs stood behind her and watched without commentary, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man watching competence, so complete it had become a kind of grammar, a language he could now recognize, even if he could not yet speak it. Voss, before his financial collapse, became total commissioned two such structures on the central section of his ranch through a contractor he hired from Bismarck. The contractor rode out to the Halverson property 3 times to take measurements and ask questions. Ingrid answered every question without charge. She did not charge anyone who came to learn. The knowledge had not originated with her. It had come from Astrid, who had received it from her own mother, who had received it from the accumulated experience of generations of people who had taken the problem of winter seriously enough to solve it properly, and charging for it would have been a category error, like charging for the physics that made it work. Wade Dunmore became the most sought-after builder in Flint Rock Basin for wool-insulated construction over the years that followed. He had understood the principles before anyone was willing to hear them, and he had built enough other structures to apply those principles efficiently at scale. He and Ingrid developed a working relationship built on the shared language of people who think about construction in terms of physics rather than convention, what a wall does rather than what a wall looks like, how heat moves rather than how a building is supposed to appear. Their collaboration on several projects over the following years attracted comment in the way that any unexpected pairing attracts comment in a small community. Neither of them adjusted their work to manage the commentary. By 1888, articles about wool insulation had appeared in agricultural publications across the Northern Plains. The Prairie Farmer ran a piece in the spring issue. The Breeder's Gazette followed with a longer technical treatment. The Rocky Mountain Husbandman published a summary of the Flint Rock Basin winter with specific reference to the Halverson barn as the primary evidence for the method's effectiveness. The writers of these pieces treated the technique not as the eccentric practice of a foreign widow, but as validated method proven by the most comprehensive field test imaginable. A winter that had killed 1.5 million cattle across the Northern Plains, while the animals inside 8 inches of raw wool lost not a single head. A professor of agricultural science at the University of Minnesota wrote to Ingrid requesting detailed specifications. She sent him a 4-page letter in her careful English describing every measurement, every material, every principle she had applied. The letter covered the double stud framing, the cavity dimensions, the importance of correct packing density, and the hand test method for confirming it, the ridge vent configuration, the vestibule design, the floor assembly from drainage stone through felt through, plank through bedding. The professor published the letter in full in his department's technical bulletin with a prefatory note. The following specifications were received from a practical builder in Dakota Territory whose experience during the winter of 1886 to 1887 constitutes the most persuasive evidence available for the superiority of natural fiber insulation in agricultural construction. He did not note that the builder was a woman. Ingrid noticed this omission when she received her copy of the bulletin and set it aside without remarking on it because remarking on it would have cost her time she needed for other things. Iris Fenton convinced her husband Colton to retrofit their existing barn with wool batting that autumn. Colton had resisted the cost of purchasing sufficient fleece to fill an existing structure was not negligible, and he had not lost as many cattle as Briggs or Voss, which meant the evidence had not been quite as legible on his operation. But Iris had spent 2 weeks inside Ingrid's barn during the worst of the winter, and she had felt what those walls felt like when you pressed your hand against the sheathing, and she told Colton in the plain, direct language she used when she had already decided something that she would not spend another winter listening to, their cattle suffer when the solution was available at 3 cents a pound. They completed the retrofit in October. The following winter, their cattle gained weight through January for the first time in 9 years of ranching on the Dakota Range. The letter from Eric's parents arrived from Minnesota in the spring of 1887, written in the trembling handwriting of people who were approaching the end of their physical capacity for correspondence. The obligation to the stepmother had been discharged, the letter said. The boy had endured enough disruption. It was time for him to come home to people who shared his blood. Tobias read the letter at the kitchen table in the dugout. He read it twice, refolded it with care, slid it across the table to Ingrid. She read it once, set it down, waited. "I'm going to write back." His voice had the quality it had developed over the winter direct, without the performance of distance that had characterized everything he said from August through October. "I'm staying." She looked at him across the table. She looked at Eric's jaw, Eric's shoulders, the features she had learned to recognize as belonging to a man she had loved and lost, arranged on a face that was no longer trying to be that man's substitute or that man's ghost. Something else had grown there over 6 months of 4 times daily temperature readings and a night of twins born in -40, in a moment in a gravel Ford store, when a boy had decided that arithmetic outweighed performance. "Why?" she asked. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had held the lantern while the lambs were born, the hands that had filled the ledger with numbers 4 times every day for 3 months, the hands that had cleared the south end of the barn in a single night so that Briggs's surviving cows would have somewhere to stand. "Because my father would have wanted me to learn from someone who knows how to keep things alive." She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and the tears she had spent on that September evening by the creek had been spent against a version of this boy that no longer fully existed. What she felt instead was something settling into its correct position, a thing that had been floating loose since the morning she left Minnesota, now finding the place where it belonged with the quiet precision of a well-made joint. "There is a loft extension that needs building," she told him. "We can start this afternoon." Tobias stayed in Dakota Territory. He learned to build insulated barns with the methodical patience of someone who has understood through direct experience why the density matters. He learned to read the autumn sky for the signs that distinguish a season that will test you from a season that will try to kill you. He learned to lamb in winter conditions that would have seemed impossible to him in November of 1886. In 1894, he married the daughter of a rancher from the Yellowstone Valley, a practical woman named Helena who had grown up understanding cold in her own way, and he built his homestead 12 miles east of Ingrid's place, on ground he had chosen himself for its water access and its southern exposure. The barn he built for his own operation was the finest wool-insulated structure in the territory by the assessment of everyone who examined it. He spent 3 months on the wall cavity alone, working through each section with the hand test his stepmother had taught him, pulling material out and repacking it until every inch of the cavity yielded exactly the right amount under his palm. When he finished, he brought Ingrid out to inspect it. She walked the perimeter of the interior, slowly pressing each section as she walked, her expression giving nothing away. At the end, she turned to him and nodded once. "Your grandmother would approve." It was the highest praise she had in her vocabulary, and he received it as such. In the years that followed, Tobias became the most effective advocate for Ingrid's methods among the ranchers who built or rebuilt after the disaster. Not because he had technical expertise that others lacked, Ingrid had more, done more, had more, but because he could tell the story from inside it. He had been the skeptic. He had lived in the same structure and believed she was wrong. He had spent the autumn being educated in the opposite direction by a man who lost most of his cattle, and he had changed his mind, not because he was argued out of his position, but because the evidence made his position impossible to maintain. When he spoke to new ranchers about the method, he did not lead with specifications or physics. He led with this: "I am the one who laughed at her. I lived in the same structure and believed she was building something foolish. Then I spent a winter inside those walls while 1.5 million cattle died on the open range around them, and I watched twin lambs stand up and nurse their mother in air that was warm enough to receive them because someone had spent 7 months making it that way. If I could change my mind, so can you." He said it dozens of times over the years. The words never changed because the truth they carried did not require variation. It only required repetition, and Tobias understood repetition. He had done it 4 times a day for 3 months, measuring a number that proved the same thing every time it was measured. Ingrid Halvorson married again in 1892. Otto Schreiber was a German-American blacksmith who had settled in Gravel Ford 2 years earlier, a quiet man with ironworkers' hands and no opinions about how other people should build their structures. He had come to Dakota from Pennsylvania, where his father had worked in the Pittsburgh iron trade, and he carried the humility of someone who has spent his life around the making of things and understands that the people who build well are rarely the people who receive the recognition. He had seen the barn, seen the flock, understood the reputation without needing it, explained. On their wedding day, he gave her a wool comb he had forged himself from the best steel in his shop, with a balance and weight that told her he had thought carefully about what it needed to be. She held it in both hands and knew with the certainty that does not require words that he understood her in the way that mattered most. They had 3 children together. The oldest they named Anders after Ingrid's first husband, and he showed from early childhood the spatial intelligence that produces good builders, the ability to see a structure before it exists, to understand load paths, the way other people understand grammar. He eventually built wool-insulated barns as far away as Montana and the northern sections of Wyoming, carrying the method out of Flint Rock Basin and into the wider territory that the disaster of 1886 to 1887 had made receptive to it. The middle child they named Astrid after Ingrid's grandmother, and she became a school teacher in Gravel Ford, who incorporated the basic principles of insulation into her science lessons, explaining to children why still air holds heat, why lanolin-bearing fiber traps still air, why the animals inside the wool barn had lived when the animals outside it had not. The youngest child they named Garrett, after the man who had carried dying lambs through chest-deep snow on his back rather than leave them behind. The original barn remained in service for 30 years. Ingrid replaced the outer sheathing twice as the Dakota winters worked on the boards, topped up the wall cavity with fresh fleece every 5 years, as the original material settled fractionally over time. But the foundational structure, the doubled framing, the floor assembly, the ventilation system, the vestibule never required rebuilding. The barn functioned on the same physical principles on the last day it operated as it had on the first night of -17, because physics does not degrade with use. Visitors came from across the territory, then from across the region. Agricultural agents, university researchers, ranchers from Montana, from Wyoming, from the eastern sections of Oregon, where the winters were different but the problem was the same. All of them walked through the same barn door, pressed their palms against the same interior wall surface, felt the same warmth that Astrid's hands had felt against a barn wall in Telemark when teaching a 9-year-old girl what insulation felt like from the inside. Ingrid showed each of them the construction. She explained the principles once clearly in the same words she had used since 1886, and then she let them draw their own conclusions from what their hands told them. She never argued with skeptics. She had spent enough of her life making that transaction, and she understood by now that the wool did not need her to defend it. The barn proved the principle every day it stood, and the principle required no advocate beyond itself. The barn outlasted her. It was still standing in 1936 when her youngest daughter sold the property and moved to Bismarck, and a photograph of it appeared that year in a Dakota Agricultural Extension Bulletin as an example of pioneer construction still serving its original purpose half a century after it was built. In 1942, a new owner demolished it to make room for a tractor shed, and the crew that did the work pried off the outer sheathing and found the wool. More than 1,000 pounds of it packed into the wall cavities 56 years earlier. Still soft, still resilient under pressure, yielding and returning, still carrying the faint but unmistakable smell of lanolin, not as a ghost of something lost, but as a property of something that had simply been waiting undisturbed for someone to open the wall and let the air reach it. The demolition crew carried it out by the armload. They brought pieces home as curiosities, as evidence, as the kind of object that resists categorization, too ordinary in its material to be called a relic, too improbable in its survival to be called ordinary. Small portions of that original fleece were passed from household to household in Flint Rock Basin for the next 30 years, kept in glass jars on mantelpieces produced on winter evenings to show to visitors. Every time a piece was brought out and turned in the lamplight, the person holding it was told the story. About the Norwegian widow who stepped off a freight wagon in 1885 with a wool comb and a leather satchel. About the barn every rancher in the territory had called a coffin for sheep. About the winter that killed 1.5 million cattle across the northern plains. About the walls that held. About the animals that lived. About the woman who had known all along what it would take to survive, because her grandmother had taught her, and her grandmother's grandmother had taught her grandmother. And somewhere far back in the cold centuries of the American experience, in the memory of Pennsylvania farmsteads, in the knowledge of people who had crossed oceans, carrying not gold or deeds, but the understanding of how to keep living things warm, someone had placed a hand against a wall of raw wool, felt it yield gently under the pressure, and return when the hand was removed, and had understood that this was enough, that it had always been enough, that the cold did not care about your opinions, only about your physics, and if your physics were right, the things in your care would live. Ingrid Halvorsen Schreiber died in 1918 at the age of 67. She was buried on the low rise above the creek near the remains of the sod dugout she had built in her first summer in Dakota in view of the barn. Her grave marker, carved by Otto from a piece of local sandstone, read, Ingrid Halvorsen Schreiber, 1851 to 1918. She knew the difference between believing and knowing.